Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. Coming up this morning, the school transfer law. It allows students from unaccredited school districts in Missouri to transfer to other schools in accredited districts nearby. But since the unaccredited districts have to pay the tuition and fees for every single student who leaves, they face bankruptcy. Now, the law also indicates the receiving schools might be forced to accept every transfer student who applies, overcrowding or not. Today, we spend some time with an expert on that law about what it does and does not mean. We'll have that when the Jaco Report returns in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back to the Jaco Report. By now, just about everybody is back in school, but a lot of questions remain about that 20-year-old Missouri law that's allowed students from the unaccredited Normandy and Riverview Gardens school districts to transfer to other accredited districts. For example, does the law actually mean that each receiving district has to take every student who applies from an unaccredited district, overcrowding or not? Since the law requires the unaccredited districts to pay tuition and transportation costs, was it designed to essentially bankrupt the unaccredited districts? Is this law the best way we have to try and fix failing school districts? And what about school choice? Does the law open the way for other students to bail out of other districts, even if those districts haven't lost their accreditation? Joining us this morning to make sense of all this is Professor Brad Desnoyer. He's professor at the University of Missouri-Columbia Law School. He studied the transfer law and wrote an op-ed piece about it for the Post-Dispatch about a dozen days ago. Brad, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me, bottom line, your reading of the law. The law seems pretty clear that it just says these districts have to accept these students. I mean, has too much been made of that, or is that what it means in your reading?
Well, when the law is this clear, there isn't much ambiguity to discuss. The problem is, if there was some ambiguity, then the court would have a little more leeway to look at the law and say, well, maybe we could say that you could raise what's called the impossibility defense, which is what the Clayton school districts originally said. It's impossible for us to take these students. But the law is very, very clear. In fact, the law used to say that districts did have discretion and may not take students.
But that was taken out.
That was taken out. And the court looks at that and says, we're going to presume that the legislator knows what they're doing. And we're going to presume they took it out for a reason.
Well, given the Missouri General Assembly, that's always a huge assumption. But bottom line is, your reading of the law is that these districts have to take all the students who apply, overcrowding or not, reasons to not do so or not, that they have to take every one of these students that applies, correct?
They certainly do. The Supreme Court said in their decision in 2013 that this concept of it's impossible to take these students doesn't fly. The only way this would possibly work is if it was something like a hurricane or a war, something that was something so large of a concept that we couldn't get the students from point A to point B.
So right now, the Rick Singfield supported school choice group and the American Civil Liberties Union, neither of them sued. The Singfield group said they'd reached an accommodation. The ACLU, mainly because they can't find any parent who's willing to take the time to be the plaintiff in the case. But I guess your read is, if somebody took this to court and said, you got to take my kid, I mean, if Clayton says you're out of room tough, you've got to go, then they'd win.
Well, certainly if it went to the Supreme Court level. The county judge, Judge David Vincent, looked at this law twice, and both times came out in favor of the county schools, Clayton schools here. They would maybe come out in favor of the school where maybe they're elected judges.
And he was overturned twice.
And he was overturned twice, exactly. The Supreme Court has made it clear you can't say it's impossible unless you've tried, and they said this, virtually every action possible to allow the students in.
So the bottom line is, all these school districts who say we can only take a certain number of students because of overcrowding, they're breaking the law.
They have to take them. They have to take the students, yes.
Pure and simple.
Yeah.
Well, but nobody's gone to court yet, so the guidelines and the niggling around the edges and the we're too overcrowded and we can take 20 students but not 50 students, that's still in effect until somebody goes to court and a judge says you can't do that.
Right, we need enforcement of it. When it came to the St. Louis schools, there were 27,000 students who were going to be possible to transfer to another school, to Clayton in that case. There, the Supreme Court said, look, it's not impossible, and we have nothing that's going to show us that it's going to be impossible. You haven't proven that it's impossible, and look, they become accredited again, so we're going to move on. With Normandy and with Riverview, you have a total of about 10,000, 11,000 students. I don't know how they can get around that when St. Louis had 27,000.
Last week, late last week, the DESE, the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, came out with some new figures showing that based on the new higher standards they've got, the Jennings District, the Ferguson-Florissant District, the University City District look like they could be in danger of possibly being unaccredited in another 2 years.
Right.
But there were 16 districts in outstate Missouri that ran the serious risk of being unaccredited within the next 2 years. I would assume then if nothing changes, that in 2015, instead of seeing this transfer mess limited to Riverview Gardens and Normandy, you could see University City, Ferguson-Florissant, Jennings, and 16 districts in rural Missouri all rolled into this.
Right. And now, if somehow all those schools in the St. Louis area, let's say, were to go unaccredited, then it might be possible, for some of the other schools to go, look, now it really is impossible. Now we really are having so many students we can't take them.
But getting back to first causes on this,
Sure.
this law was written essentially in order never to be used. The lawmakers who drafted it never thought it would happen. 20 years ago, they thought this would never happen in a million years. Well, it did happen. And my question is this law essentially designed to bankrupt these school districts? And if it does, is that really the best way to improve a failing school district?
Well, it's a good question of what was the reason behind the design, and that's just something that's not very clear. One argument that's been made is that the point of the law was to work for an unaccredited high school, one school, not a whole district, and that would be easier to transfer. But if school does go bankrupt, that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, the school will be saved. Right now, we have a similar procedure with St. Louis City. When that school district became unaccredited, there was a law on the books that said when a city school like St. Louis City or Kansas City, those two schools, become unaccredited, we're going to have a state takeover, which is essentially the same as saying a bankrupt school will have a state takeover. The question is, has St. Louis really turned around in that year since the state takeover? So how much will having a chief executive appointed by the governor really change everything?
Now, your op-ed hit to an interesting point, which is that this makes the funding differentials between a Ladue and a Hayti in southeast Missouri or a Jennings just that much more urgent, that some schools, because of property taxes, have a lot of money. Some schools that are poverty-stricken have almost none. Right.
Now, there's two arguments there. Now, first of all, there is a big discrepancy, especially between rural schools and suburban schools and urban schools and suburban schools. In a 2011 study looked at this, and they said that Missouri was the 5th highest state in local funding being the primary source of funding, local property taxes. We are 47th in terms of state funding. So what we have here is schools that are basically being funded by local property taxes. But that's not the end of the story. Normandy receives an average amount of income. The question you have to look at, though, in these, a lot of people will argue, well, they receive the same amount of money. So isn't that fair? But how much of this money is going to other programs like reduced lunch or hiring additional teachers or teachers' aides? And so you really can't get at the problem just by looking at expenditures. But what you can see is that when you have schools in Poplar Bluff that are getting half as much money as schools in suburban areas, there obviously is a problem in how we're funding education and trying to treat all of our students.
Final quick question then. Do you hope that this entire mess leads the legislature or someone to take a look overall at how you pay for schools and what the best outcomes are for kids? Because right now this seems like an awful way to run a railroad.
Well, there certainly is a lot of problems with the way we fund schools, and it's a bigger social issue than just the way we fund schools. It gets into the whole idea of affordable housing and what are we really putting our money towards with cutting funding to Head Start, First Steps, all these early education programs. It's a really large social issue, and unfortunately people don't want to fund things early and invest. And instead, we end up paying more in the long term rather than investing initially.
Brad Desnoyer from the Mizzou Law School. Brad, thank you very much for coming in. It was my pleasure. We hope you can join us back here next Sunday morning for another edition of the Jaco Report.